The day my family erased my name from the company records, my father looked me in the eyes and said, "You should be grateful we're letting you leave with your dignity." I remember almost laughing, not because it was funny, because I had spent 12 years giving that company everything I had, and somehow they believed dignity was something they were allowing me to keep. The boardroom was silent. My younger brother, Adrian, sat beside my father with the new acquisition documents in front of him. My mother wouldn't look at me. And across the table sat Victor Hale, the investor my family had brought in 3 months earlier. He was the man who had been quietly buying influence inside our company. And now he owned enough shares to decide who stayed. Apparently, the answer was not me. My father pushed a folder across the table. "Sign it." I opened it. It was a separation agreement. No executive position. No ownership stake. No severance beyond 3 months' salary. And, most importantly, a clause preventing me from working with any company that could be considered a competitor for 5 years. I stared at the pages. "You're removing me completely?" Adrian leaned back. "You're not being removed. You're being released." Released. That was the word they chose. I looked at him. "You couldn't even say fired?" His expression didn't change. "You've become emotional about the business." My father sighed. "That is exactly the problem." I slowly turned toward him. "Emotional? You've spent years protecting old methods instead of accepting change," he said. "Adrian understands where the company needs to go." I looked at my brother. Adrian smiled faintly. He had never built anything in his life, but he had always been very good at standing beside people who did. I had designed our logistics platform from scratch. I had rebuilt our failing distribution network. I had spent nights sleeping in empty offices because a warehouse system had crashed and thousands of orders were stuck. When the company nearly went bankrupt 6 years earlier, I had personally negotiated with suppliers and convinced them to wait for payment. When my father had been hospitalized, I had taken over operations for 11 months. And now I was apparently too emotional to remain useful. I looked down at the agreement again. Then something inside me became strangely quiet. For years, I had believed that if I worked hard enough, my family would eventually see me. That belief had kept me obedient. It had kept me forgiving. It had kept me sitting at tables where my chair was slowly being pushed farther and farther away. But that afternoon, I finally understood something. They had seen me. They simply didn't value me. I picked up the pen. My father's eyebrows lifted. "You're signing?" "Yes." Adrian looked almost disappointed. Perhaps he had expected a fight. He should have known me better. I signed every page. Then I placed the pen on the table. My father cleared his throat. "Your apartment? I'll move out tonight. You don't have to be dramatic." I looked at him. I wasn't being dramatic. For the first time, his expression changed. I stood. My mother finally spoke. "Ethan." I stopped. She looked frightened. Not sad. Frightened. As if she knew something the others didn't. "You'll come back," she whispered. I said nothing. I walked out. That night, I packed 1 suitcase. 2 shirts. 3 pairs of jeans. My old laptop. A watch my grandfather had given me when I was 19. And a small metal box containing the first circuit board I had ever designed. That was everything I owned after 12 years of building an empire that wasn't mine. When I closed the apartment door behind me, I expected to feel anger. Instead, I felt empty. I drove without knowing where I was going. Around midnight, I stopped beside a quiet roadside cafe and ordered coffee. My phone kept vibrating. Messages from Adrian. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Then another. "Dad says you should return the company car tomorrow." Then another. "Mom wants to know if you're okay." I stared at the screen. I typed 3 different replies. I deleted all of them. For the first time in my life, I had nothing left to explain. I turned off my phone. Outside, rain began tapping against the windows. And as I watched the water run down the glass, I remembered something my grandfather had once told me. He had taken me into the old workshop when I was 17. There had been broken machines everywhere. I had complained that the company would never fix them. He laughed. "Then build something better." I had asked him, "What if nobody believes in it?" He looked at me and said, "Build it anyway." Back then, I thought he was teaching me about machines. Years later, I realized he had been teaching me about life. I just hadn't understood it yet. The next morning, I returned the company car. My father didn't come downstairs. Adrian did. He took the keys and looked at my suitcase. You really left? Yes. He smiled. You'll be back in a month. I looked at the building behind him. The glass walls. The logo. The company I had spent half my life saving. Then I looked back at my brother. No, I said quietly. I don't think I will. He laughed. I walked away. Neither of us knew that this was the last time Adrian would ever see me as the man who had lost everything. Because I hadn't lost everything. I had simply stopped building for them. And somewhere inside that silence, I was about to start building for myself. 3 weeks after I left, my life had become almost embarrassingly ordinary. I rented a tiny room above a repair shop on the edge of the city. The ceiling leaked whenever it rained. The window wouldn't close properly. The bed was so narrow that turning over at night required negotiation. But nobody there knew my family name. Nobody cared who my father was. Nobody expected me to prove that I belonged somewhere. For the first time in years, I could breathe. I found temporary work repairing industrial control systems. It wasn't prestigious. The owner, Mr. Malik, didn't even ask about my previous position. On my first day, he handed me a screwdriver and pointed toward a dead machine. Can you fix it? I opened the panel. Probably. Probably isn't an answer. I smiled. Then yes. He watched me work. 20 minutes later, the machine restarted. He stared at it. You've done this before. A few times. He laughed. You're either very humble or very strange. I didn't tell him that the machine he had considered useless had a problem I had solved hundreds of times. I simply went back to work. Days became weeks. I repaired machines. I wrote small automation programs at night. I started keeping notes about a problem I had noticed during my years at my family's company. It was something I had been trying to solve quietly for almost 4 years. A new logistics system, not another ordinary warehouse platform. I wanted to create something that could predict supply disruptions before they happened. At my family's company, I had proposed the idea twice. Both times, Adrian had rejected it. Too expensive. Too complicated. Nobody needs that. So I'd stopped talking about it. But I had never stopped thinking about it. Now, with nobody telling me what was impossible, I began again. My first prototype failed. The second crashed after 6 hours. The third produced results so inaccurate that I nearly threw my laptop against the wall. I didn't. I repaired it. Then I tried again. One evening, while I was staring at a spreadsheet filled with errors, someone knocked on my door. It was Mr. Malik. You haven't eaten. I forgot. You've been saying that for 3 days. He put a paper bag on the desk. Inside was dinner. I looked at him. Why? He shrugged. Because people who forget to eat usually forget other important things too. I laughed. It was the first genuine laugh I'd had in months. That small moment changed something. I realized I didn't need to become powerful immediately. I didn't need to prove my family wrong. I only needed to become someone I respected. So I worked, quietly, month after month. My prototype slowly improved. Then, one evening, it predicted a supply delay with almost impossible accuracy. I stared at the screen. I ran the test again. Same result. Again. Same. My hands began to shake. Not because I had become rich. Not because I had won. But because for the first time, I knew the thing I had carried inside me for years might actually work. I named the system North Star. I registered a small company under a name nobody in my family would recognize. I used my savings. Then I borrowed a little. Then I brought in 2 engineers who believed in the idea. One of them was a woman named Clara. She was sharp, patient, and impossible to impress. On our first meeting, she studied my prototype for almost an hour. Finally, she said, "This is either brilliant or completely insane." Which one? She looked at me. Asked me after we make money. I smiled. Fair. Neither of us knew then how important she would become in my life. Meanwhile, back at my family's company, things were changing too. At first, I heard nothing. Then Mr. Malik mentioned that my former employer had lost a major contract. I pretended not to care. 2 weeks later, another client left. Then another. I still didn't call anyone. My father didn't call me either. Adrian apparently had a new strategy. He was cutting costs, replacing experienced managers, outsourcing systems, selling parts of the company to Victor Hale. From the outside, it looked like progress. Inside, however, The foundation was weakening. The old systems I had built were being dismantled without anyone understanding how they connected. And then, 6 months after I left, my phone rang. I almost didn't answer. It was my mother. Her voice was unusually quiet. "Ethan." I closed my eyes. "Yes." There was silence. Then she said the sentence that made me realize something had gone very wrong. "Your father wants to see you." I looked at the prototype glowing on my desk. For months, I had wondered whether they would ever understand what they had thrown away. Now, for the first time, I wondered whether they were beginning to. "What happened?" I asked. My mother hesitated. "Adrian says everything is under control." That doesn't answer my question. Another silence. Then she whispered, "Victor wants to take the company." I sat back. Outside my window, the city lights flickered against the dark. 6 months ago, I had walked away with one suitcase. Now, the family that had told me I was replaceable was standing on the edge of losing everything. And they had no idea that the man they had discarded was quietly building the one thing their entire industry was about to need. I didn't tell my mother about North Star. Not yet. I simply said, "I'm sorry." She sounded almost relieved. "Will you come home?" I looked at my laptop, at the code, at the life I had built from nothing. Then I answered honestly, "I don't know." And for the first time, I understood that walking away had never been the end of my story. It had only been the moment I finally began writing it myself. I didn't go home that night. I told my mother I needed time, and she didn't argue. For the first time in my life, I realized I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. The next morning, Clara found me staring at the same line of code for nearly 10 minutes. "You look terrible." I slept. "No, you didn't." I closed my eyes. "That isn't the same thing." I smiled weakly. She put a coffee beside my laptop. "What happened?" "My family is in trouble." She leaned against the desk. "The family you never talk about?" "Yes." "The company you used to work for?" "Yes." She nodded. "And you're thinking about going back?" I didn't answer. She studied me for a moment. "Ethan, if you go back because you miss them, that's one thing. And if I go back because they need me, that's another." I looked at her. "What would you do?" I'd ask whether they need me or whether they need what I can do. Her words stayed with me. That afternoon, my father called. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hello." His voice was different. Older. Tired. "Can you come by?" I almost laughed. A year ago, I would have driven across the city immediately. Now I ask why. "We need to talk." "About what?" He hesitated. "The company." I leaned back. "I don't work there anymore." "I know. You made sure of that." Silence. Then he said quietly, "I know." That sentence hurt more than I expected. Not because it fixed anything, because it was the first time he had admitted it. I agreed to meet him the next afternoon. When I entered the old company building, nobody stopped me, but everyone looked. Some employees remembered me. Others only knew the stories. I had become a strange kind of rumor. The son who had left. The executive who had supposedly failed. The man who had refused to fight for his position. I walked into my father's office. He looked smaller than I remembered. There were papers everywhere. Financial reports, contract notices, legal documents. And on the wall behind him was a photograph of our family standing together at the company's 20th anniversary. I was 27 in that picture. Adrian was 23. My father had his arms around both of us. I remember that night. Adrian had whispered, "One day this will all be mine." I had laughed. "Then I'll make sure it's still standing." He had punched my shoulder. "You always think you're responsible for everything." I had smiled. Maybe he was right. My father pushed a document toward me. "We're losing the company." I looked at the numbers. The situation was worse than my mother had described. "Victor, he has been acquiring our debt." And Adrian, my father closed his eyes. "He trusted the wrong people." I almost said, he trusted himself too much. Instead, I asked, "Why me?" "Because you built most of the infrastructure." "Built," I corrected. Past tense. He nodded. "I know." I looked through the reports. Their new logistics system was failing. Inventory errors were increasing. Delivery times had doubled. Clients were leaving. And someone had made the disastrous decision to sell access to their internal data to an outside contractor. I recognized the pattern immediately. Victor wasn't trying to save the company. He was preparing to own it. "You're being stripped from the inside," I said. My father stared at me. "Can you stop it?" I closed the folder. I could have. His expression tightened. Could. I stood. You didn't ask me to stay when you replaced me. Ethan, you didn't ask why I warned you about Victor. I was wrong. Yes. He swallowed. Then he said something I had never expected to hear. I was ashamed. I stopped. He looked down. When you left, I told myself you were stubborn. I told myself you would return when reality caught up with you. He gave a bitter smile. Then every week you didn't return became harder for me to explain. I said nothing. I didn't know how much you were carrying, he continued. No, I said softly. You didn't. He looked at me. Can you help us? I thought about it. Then I asked, if I say yes, what happens to Adrian? My father looked away. He stays. I nodded. Then my answer is no. I walked toward the door. Ethan. I turned. My father looked exhausted. Why? I answered honestly. Because I won't save a company that still believes it can discard me whenever I'm no longer convenient. I left. But as I stepped into the hallway, I saw Adrian. He had been standing near the elevator. His face was pale. You really won't help? No. You're enjoying this. I shook my head. No. You have no idea what we're dealing with. I probably understand it better than you do. His jaw tightened. You always thought you were smarter. I never said that. You didn't have to. The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside. Just before they closed, Adrian said, You'll regret this. I looked at him. I already regretted staying. The doors shut. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty. 3 months later, North Star got its first serious offer. A regional shipping company wanted to license the system. They weren't impressed by our office. We didn't have an office. We met in a rented conference room above a bakery. They weren't impressed by our team. There were only 3 of us. But when Clara demonstrated North Star's predictive model, the executives stopped smiling politely. One of them leaned forward. How far ahead can it detect disruption? Depends on the data, Clara said. What if the supplier suddenly shuts down? I answered. It won't just tell you that there's a problem. It'll calculate the probability of failure and suggest alternate routes before the disruption becomes visible. The executive stared at me. You built this? Yes. Why? I thought about my old company, about nights spent fixing problems after they happened, because I got tired of cleaning up disasters that could have been prevented. He looked at the others. Then he said, How much? That was the beginning. Our first contract wasn't enormous, but it was enough. Enough to hire 2 more engineers. Enough to move into a small office. Enough to prove that North Star wasn't just an experiment. Then something unexpected happened. A second company signed, then a third. Within a year, our system was being used by warehouses, manufacturers, and regional distributors. I was still careful with money. I remembered the night I had counted the last bills in my suitcase. I remembered the leaking ceiling. I remembered eating instant noodles for 3 days because I was afraid of spending too much. Success didn't make me forget those things. It made me grateful I had survived them. Clara became more than my business partner. She became the person I trusted with the parts of myself I usually kept hidden. One evening, after everyone had gone home, she found me standing beside the office window. You're thinking about them again. I smiled. Do I really make it that obvious? Yes. She came beside me. You don't have to hate them. I don't. You don't have to forgive them either. I know. She looked at me. What do you want? I thought for a moment. Peace. She smiled. That sounds expensive. It probably is. She laughed. Then her expression softened. You know what I think? What? You spent years trying to prove you belonged in that family. She paused. You don't realize you stopped needing to prove it. I looked at her. There was something in her eyes that made me uncomfortable. Not because it was bad, because it was kind. And I wasn't used to kindness that expected nothing in return. Before I could answer, my phone rang. My father's name appeared. I almost ignored it. Then I answered. Hello. His voice was barely audible. Ethan. Yes. We lost the contract with Meridian. I closed my eyes. Meridian was their largest client. If they lose Meridian, Victor will have enough leverage to take control, I said. He already does. I said nothing. Then my father asked, Did you know this would happen? No. A pause. Are you doing this? I almost couldn't believe the question. No. I had to ask. Why? Because Adrian says you've built a company that is competing with us. I looked across the room at Clara. She had gone still. I answered, I didn't build North Star to compete with you. My father whispered, what did you build it for? I looked at the skyline. To make something that couldn't be taken away from me. Silence. Then he asked, is it really that successful? I didn't answer. He understood. You've been doing this all this time. Yes. And you never told us. You never asked. That hurt him. I could hear it, but I couldn't take it back. The call ended. The next morning, something strange happened. An email arrived from an unfamiliar legal firm. It contained a lawsuit. My family was accusing North Star of using proprietary technology stolen from their company. I read the document twice. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, because now I finally understood why Victor had been so interested in my departure. They weren't simply trying to save their company. They were trying to claim the one thing they feared most. Me, or rather, what I had built. Clara read the lawsuit. Her face hardened. They're saying North Star belongs to them. No. You worked there when you developed the early concept. Yes. So they think they can claim it. They can try. She looked at me. What are we going to do? I closed the folder. For once, we're not going to run. That night, I opened the metal box I carried with me when I left. Inside was the first circuit board I had ever designed. Beneath it was an old notebook. I turned the pages. 4 years before I left my family, I had written the original architecture for North Star. Every major concept had been developed on my own time. Every prototype had been built on my own equipment. And I had something else, something I had forgotten about until that moment. A dated email, sent to myself, with a complete technical design attached. 4 years before my departure. I stared at the timestamp. Then I smiled. They had no idea what they had just started, because they thought I had walked away with nothing. They didn't realize I had walked away carrying proof that everything they feared had been built long before I ever left them. And now, for the first time, I was ready to let the truth speak for itself. The lawsuit arrived on a Monday. By Tuesday morning, every major business publication in the city was talking about North Star. Not because we had done anything wrong, because Victor Hale had made sure our name appeared beside words like stolen technology, family dispute, and corporate betrayal. My lawyers told me not to respond publicly. Let them make noise, our attorney, Daniel said. We respond with evidence. I nodded. That was exactly what I wanted. For years, I had been accused of being too emotional. This time, I would give them nothing emotional to use. We spent 2 weeks collecting records. Old notebooks, emails, development logs, cloud backups, payment receipts, server timestamps. Every piece mattered. And slowly, the truth became impossible to ignore. North Star wasn't built using my family's technology. The original architecture had been designed 4 years before I left. The prototype had been developed on my personal laptop. The first successful model had been trained using public datasets and independently purchased data. Even the early testing records were time-stamped. Daniel looked through the evidence and leaned back. You know what's interesting? What? They don't have a strong case. That's good. No, he said. What's interesting is that they know it. I looked at him. Then why file? To scare you. It worked for about 5 minutes. Then I remembered the man I had been before. The man who would have called his father. The man who would have asked Adrian to talk. The man who would have apologized even when he was the one being hurt. That man was gone. Not because I had become cruel. Because I had finally learned the difference between forgiveness and surrender. We went to court. My family was there. My father sat beside Adrian. My mother was behind them. Victor was at the opposite table, perfectly calm. When I entered, Adrian looked at me. His expression wasn't angry. It was almost hopeful, as if he still believed the lawsuit might force me back into the family. It didn't. The judge reviewed the evidence. Daniel presented the original documents. Then came the timestamps. For years before my resignation. 3 years before Victor entered the company. 2 years before North Star was officially registered. The judge asked their attorney, "Do you dispute the authenticity of these records?" The attorney hesitated. "No." Then what exactly is the basis of the claim? Nobody answered immediately. Finally, Victor's lawyer said they believed the technology had been conceptually derived from my employment. Daniel stood. "Your Honor, Having an idea while employed does not make every future idea that employee ever has company property. The judge nodded. The hearing was postponed. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Microphones appeared in front of me. Mr. Carter, did your family steal your work? Are you seeking revenge? Will you take control of your family's company? I kept walking. Then someone shouted, "Did you leave because you knew you could build something better?" I stopped. For a second, I considered answering. Instead, I said, "I left because I realized I couldn't keep sacrificing my life to people who didn't respect it." Then I walked away. The clip went viral. I didn't care. What happened next mattered more. The lawsuit collapsed within weeks. The court ruled that North Star was independently developed. My family was ordered to withdraw the claim. But the damage wasn't finished. Clients began leaving my family's company. Not because I asked them to, because they no longer trusted Victor. Meridian was the first to terminate its agreement. Then 2 major suppliers demanded payment up front. Then the bank froze additional credit. Adrian tried to keep everything together. He failed. One evening, my father called again. "Ethan." "Yes. I need to ask you something." "What? Did you know this would happen?" I looked at the North Star office around me. Engineers were still working. Clara was reviewing a report. Nobody was afraid. "No," I said. "You really didn't?" "No." He was quiet. Then he whispered, "I thought you had nothing." I closed my eyes. That was the problem. He didn't understand. "You thought I had nothing because I stopped giving everything to you." He said nothing. Then he asked, "Would you buy the company?" I almost laughed. "Why? To save it." "No. Ethan, please. I won't become the owner of the thing you threw me out of just to prove I deserve to stay. You're my son, and I was your son when you signed me away." The silence between us became heavy. Finally, he said, "I miss you." That was the sentence that hurt. Not because I wanted to hear it, because I'd spent years waiting for it. I could have answered with anger. Instead, I said, "I miss who I thought you were." Then I ended the call. I sat alone for a long time. Clara eventually came in my office. She didn't ask what happened. She simply sat beside me. After a while, she said, "You're allowed to grieve something even if it hurt you." I looked at her. "I know." "No," she said softly. "I don't think you do." I smiled. Maybe she was right. For the first time since leaving, I allowed myself to admit that I had lost more than a job. I had lost the family I believed I had, and no amount of success could change that. But success had given me something else. A chance to build relationships that weren't based on obligation. A chance to become someone who didn't need to be chosen by people who had already rejected him. And I was beginning to understand that maybe that was enough. The collapse of my family's company happened faster than anyone expected. Victor had promised investors that Adrian could transform the business. Instead, Adrian discovered that removing experienced people was easier than replacing them. One by one, departments began failing. A warehouse in the north lost an entire shipment because the inventory system couldn't reconcile 2 databases. A manufacturing client suffered weeks of delays. Then a major supplier filed a claim over unpaid invoices. Adrian finally called me. Not my father. "Adrian, I need help." I was standing in the kitchen when I answered. "What kind?" "You know what kind." "No, I want you to say it." He exhaled. "North Star." I closed my eyes. "You want access to my system?" "Yes." "No, you haven't even heard the offer." "I don't need to." "Ethan, this isn't about pride." "Then why did you spend a year telling everyone I was replaceable?" Silence. "You were angry," he said. "I was hurt." "I know." "No," I said. "You know now." He lowered his voice. "I was jealous." That surprised me. "Of what?" "You." I sat down. Adrian continued. "Dad trusted you with everything. Employees listened to you. Grandpa talked about you like you were the future." I said nothing. "You were always the one who knew how things worked. And you thought taking my position would make you become me. I thought if you were gone, I'd finally be enough." His confession was so honest that for a moment I didn't know what to say. Then I asked, "Did it work?" "No." His voice cracked. I became the man who pushed away the only person who would have helped me. I closed my eyes. There it was. The regret I had once imagined. And strangely, it didn't feel satisfying. It felt sad. "I hope you find your own life," I said. "Does that mean you'll help?" "No." "Why?" because helping you would only postpone the consequences. He was quiet. Then he said, I understand. I ended the call. That night, I went for a walk. I passed a small bookstore and stopped. In the window was a book about industrial innovation. I remember my grandfather again. He had always told me that the strongest people weren't the ones who controlled everything. They were the ones who could build something that survived without them. I smiled. Maybe that was what I had been trying to do all along. A week later, North Star received a major international investment offer. It was more money than I had ever seen in one place. The board wanted rapid expansion. I agreed, but with conditions. I refused to sell controlling ownership. I refused to build an empire around my name. And I insisted that every engineer who had helped build North Star receive equity. When the agreement was signed, Clara looked at me. You realize you're terrible at being greedy. I'll survive. She laughed. Then she became serious. I'm proud of you. Those words affected me more than the investment. I looked at her. Why? Because when you finally had power, you didn't become the people who hurt you. I didn't know how to answer, so I reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. That was how our relationship changed. Not dramatically, not with some perfect confession. It simply became easier to sit beside her, easier to tell her what I was afraid of, easier to imagine tomorrow. And one evening, months later, she asked, Are you still waiting for your father to apologize? I thought about it. No, really, I think I've been waiting for myself to stop needing it. She smiled. And I think I'm finally there. The following month, I received an invitation. My family's old company was being sold. The buyer wanted me present during the final transition because North Star had become the most important technology partner in the region. I almost declined. I decided to go. Not for revenge. Not for them. For closure. When I entered the old headquarters, it felt smaller. The walls were the same. The marble floor was the same. The logo was still above reception. But I no longer felt like I was walking into the center of my world. It was just a building. My father was waiting in the boardroom. He stood when I entered. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, You look well. I am. He smiled sadly. I suppose that's what I wanted. I sat across from him. What? To know that you were okay. I looked at him. You could have asked. I was too proud. I know. He nodded. Then he pushed a small box across the table. I opened it. Inside was my grandfather's old fountain pen, the one I thought had been lost years ago. My father said, He left it for you. I stared at it. He told me to give it to you when you were ready to lead. My throat tightened. You kept it all these years? Yes. Why didn't you give it to me? My father looked down. Because I wanted you to earn it. I almost smiled. I spent my whole life earning it. I know. He looked up. And I'm sorry I made you think you hadn't. For the first time, I believed him. Not because the words were perfect, but because there was no excuse attached to them. I closed the box. I forgive you. His eyes filled with tears. Then I added, But I can't come back. He nodded slowly. I know. Outside the window, the city stretched beneath the afternoon sun. Once, I had believed leaving this building meant losing my future. Now I understood. It had been the moment I finally found it. My father's apology didn't repair our family. It repaired something inside me. There was a difference. After that meeting, I stopped replaying old conversations in my head. I stopped imagining what I should have said. I stopped wondering whether I could have worked harder, spoken softer, waited longer, forgiven faster. For years, I had treated my family's rejection like a puzzle I could solve if I found the right combination of patience and sacrifice. There was no combination. Some doors closed because the people behind them chose to close them. And sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is stop knocking. North Star continued growing. We expanded into 3 countries. Our team grew from 5 people to nearly 80. But I made one rule clear from the beginning. Nobody at North Star would ever be treated as disposable. If someone made a mistake, we fixed it. If someone disagreed with me, they could say so. If I was wrong, I wanted to hear it. Clara teased me about it one evening. You're building the company you wish your family had built. I smiled. Maybe. She shook her head. No, you're building the company you needed when you were younger. That stayed with me. Because she was right. I had spent years believing leadership meant carrying everything alone. Now I understood that leadership was making sure nobody had to. One Friday evening, We stayed late. The office was nearly empty. Clara placed 2 cups of tea on my desk. You're avoiding something. What? She pointed at the envelope beside my laptop. It was from my father. I hadn't opened it. I finally did. Inside was an invitation. My family's old property was being sold. The buyer wanted the final transition meeting at the estate where I had grown up. I hadn't been there in years. I didn't want to go. But there was one sentence in the letter that changed my mind. Your grandfather's workshop will be included in the sale. I stared at that line for a long time. That workshop had been where everything started. My first machine, my first circuit board, my first conversation with my grandfather about building instead of complaining. I decided to go. The estate looked exactly the same. The old iron gate, the stone pathway, the enormous oak tree near the entrance. But the house seemed smaller. I remembered running through those halls as a child. I remembered Adrian and me racing upstairs. I remembered my mother yelling that we would break something. I remember my father teaching us to ride bicycles. For a moment, the years disappeared. Then I saw Adrian standing beside the porch. He looked different, not weaker, just tired. He approached slowly. You came. Yes. I didn't think you would. I almost didn't. He nodded. We walked toward the workshop together. Neither of us spoke. Inside, dust covered the old benches. The machines were still there. My grandfather's work table was untouched. I ran my fingers across the surface. I remembered sitting there at 17. I had been frustrated because my first circuit wouldn't work. Grandfather had stood behind me. You're trying to make it perfect. I wanted to work. Then stop trying to impress the machine. I laughed at the memory. Adrian looked at me. You still remember everything. Not everything. Enough. He sat on the old stool. I used to hate this place. Why? Because Grandpa liked you more. I looked at him. He didn't. You believed him. He believed in both of us. Adrian smiled sadly. You always needed to believe there was enough love for everyone. I didn't answer. He looked around. Do you remember when we promised we'd run the company together? Yes. I broke that promise. You did. I thought if I became the heir, I'd finally feel important. And did you? He laughed without humor. No. We stood in silence. Then he said, I'm selling my shares. I looked at him. Why? Because I don't want to spend the rest of my life trying to prove I'm someone I'm not. That was the first decision Adrian had made for himself. Not for our father. Not for Victor. Not to compete with me. For himself. I respected that. What will you do? I don't know. I smiled. That might be the first honest answer you've ever given. He laughed. For a moment, we were brothers again. Not rivals. Not heirs. Just 2 men standing in the room where we had once been children. Then Adrian handed me a key. I stared at it. What's this? The workshop. I looked at him. It's yours. I don't need it. I know. He smiled. That's why I'm giving it to you. I didn't turn the workshop into another North Star office. I kept it exactly as it was. The old machines, the scratched wooden table, the faded photographs. I restored one corner and turned it into a small innovation lab for young engineers. Every month, we invited students who couldn't afford expensive equipment. They could come in, experiment, fail, and try again. No grades, no investors, no pressure, just curiosity. The first time I watched a 19-year-old girl build a crude robotic arm on my grandfather's workbench, I understood why he had loved that place. He hadn't wanted me to inherit a company. He wanted me to inherit a way of thinking, build something better, even if nobody believes in it. That became the unofficial motto of the workshop. Meanwhile, my father retired. He sold his remaining shares and moved to a quieter town. We spoke occasionally. Not every day, not like before, but enough. Our relationship became something new, less like father and son trapped inside old expectations. More like 2 adults learning how to know each other again. One afternoon, he visited North Star. He stood in the lobby looking at our team. Engineers laughing. People arguing over designs. Managers listening to junior employees. He watched for a long time. Then he said, You built all this. I smiled. We built it. He looked at me. You always say that. Because it's true. He nodded. I used to think a leader had to be the smartest person in the room. And now I think the leader should make the room smarter. I laughed. You've changed. So have you. He smiled. I suppose we both needed to lose something. I didn't ask what he meant. I already knew. He had lost a company. I had lost a family. And somehow, through the wreckage, both of us had learned what mattered. But not everyone changed. Victor Hale didn't. After losing control of my family's company, he moved on to another acquisition. Months later, regulators discovered irregularities in several of his transactions. There was no dramatic downfall, no courtroom spectacle, just investigations, fines, lost investors, and eventually the quiet collapse of his reputation. I never celebrated it. I didn't even follow the news closely. His consequences belonged to him. Mine belonged to me. Adrian eventually started a small business helping independent manufacturers improve their operations. It was modest. He struggled. He made mistakes. But he was happier than I had ever seen him. One evening, he called me. I made my first profit. I laughed. Congratulations. It was tiny. Profit is profit. I wanted to tell you first. I smiled. I'm glad. There was a pause. Then he said, Ethan, yes. Do you ever wish you had fought harder for the company? I looked around my office, at the North Star logo, at the photographs of our team, at the workshop key on my desk. No, not even once. No. He sighed. I think I finally understand why. Why? Because you weren't trying to win the company. I waited. You were trying to win yourself back. His words hit harder than he probably realized. I smiled. Maybe. After the call ended, Clara walked into my office. She had been with North Star for 3 years. And somewhere during those 3 years, she had become the person I wanted beside me when everything was quiet. She sat down. Good news. My brother made his first profit. She smiled. That's nice. Yeah. She looked at me. You're happy. I am. Then why do you look like you're thinking about something? I reached into my desk drawer. Inside was a small ring box. I had bought it 2 weeks earlier. I had been waiting for the right moment. Then I realized there was no perfect moment. There was only an honest one. I placed the box on the desk. Clara stared at it, then at me. Ethan, I don't have a speech. Good. I've spent most of my life thinking I needed to build everything before I deserve happiness. She was silent. I don't believe that anymore. I opened the box. Would you build the rest of it with me? Her eyes filled with tears. Then she laughed. That was almost a speech. I smiled. Is that a yes? She reached across the desk and took my hand. Yes. There was no applause, no dramatic music, no audience, just 2 people choosing each other. And somehow, that felt more valuable than anything I had ever built. Months later, we married quietly. My father came. My mother came. Adrian came alone. There was no grand family celebration, no attempt to pretend the past hadn't happened. But there was peace. At the reception, my father approached me. I want to tell you something. What? You walked away with nothing. I smiled. I remember. He looked toward Clara, then toward our friends, then toward the people who had built North Star beside me. No, he said. You walked away with exactly what you needed. I looked at him. What? The chance to build a life nobody else could take from you. For once, I didn't correct him, because he was right. I thought my greatest victory was North Star. It wasn't. North Star was simply proof of something more important. I had finally stopped measuring my worth by what my family was willing to give me. And that was freedom. 2 years after Clara and I married, North Star received the offer that changed the scale of everything. A multinational manufacturing group wanted to acquire a controlling stake. The number on the proposal was so large that our finance director thought I had misunderstood it. Clara read the document twice. They want this much. Yes. For North Star? Yes. She looked at me. And I said no. She laughed. I knew you would. It wasn't because I was afraid of becoming wealthy. It was because I had already learned what happened when ownership became more important than people. I didn't want North Star to become another company where someone could sit in a room and decide which human beings were worth keeping. So we negotiated a different arrangement. They could invest. They could partner. But control would remain with the people who had built the company. The board approved it. Our team celebrated. I didn't. That night, I went to the old workshop. The city was quiet. I sat on my grandfather's workbench and opened the old metal box. Inside was the circuit board I had carried when I left my family. It was scratched. ugly, almost useless, but it represented the beginning. I remembered the night I packed it. I had believed I was carrying a piece of my past. Now I understood I had carried proof that my future had already been inside me. My phone rang. It was my mother. "Are you busy?" "No. I need to tell you something." Her voice sounded nervous. "What happened?" "Your father is sick." I froze. Not because I was shocked by the possibility, because I suddenly remembered how old he had become. "How serious?" "They found something during a checkup." I didn't ask for details. "I'll come." The next morning, I drove to the hospital. My father was sitting beside the window when I entered. He looked thinner, but when he saw me, he smiled. "You came." "Of course." He shook his head. "I still don't understand why you're kind to me." I pulled up a chair. "Because you're my father." He looked down. "I don't deserve it." "This isn't about deserving." He was quiet. Then he said, "When I thought you had nothing, I treated you like you were nothing." I didn't answer. "When I learned what you'd built, I realized how wrong I was." I looked at him. "I don't want you to spend your remaining years feeling guilty." He swallowed. "What do you want me to feel?" "Peace." He laughed softly. "You always were better at giving advice than taking it." "Probably." He looked toward the window. "Do you remember the night you left?" "Yes." I stood at the window. I looked at him. "You did?" "Yes." He smiled sadly. "I watched you put that suitcase into your car." My chest tightened. "I wanted to stop you." "Why didn't you?" "Pride." He closed his eyes. "And fear." "Fear of what?" "That if I called you back, I have to admit I was wrong." I looked at him for a long time. Then I said, "You were wrong." "I know." "And I was hurt." "I know. But I'm not carrying it anymore." His eyes filled with tears. "Thank you." I reached for his hand. We stayed like that for several minutes. No speeches. No dramatic forgiveness. Just a father and son finally sitting together without an argument between them. When I left the hospital, I called Clara. "How is he?" "Fragile." She was quiet. Then she said, "Come home." I smiled. "I am." When I arrived, she was waiting at the door. She didn't ask questions. She simply hugged me. And for the first time, I understood something I had never understood as a younger man. Family wasn't always the people who shared your blood. Sometimes family was the person who noticed you were hurting before you said anything. Sometimes it was the person who stayed. Sometimes it was the people who believed in you when you had nothing. And sometimes, if you were lucky, it was the family you chose after the first one taught you what you needed to learn. My father recovered slowly. He never returned to the company. He didn't want to. Instead, he began visiting the workshop once a month. At first, it was awkward. Then it became routine. He would sit near the old workbench while I showed him what the students were building. One afternoon, a 12-year-old boy brought him a small machine. "It doesn't work," the boy said. My father smiled. "Then fix it." The boy frowned. "I don't know how." My father looked at me. Then he repeated something my grandfather had once told me. "Build it anyway." I stared at him. He smiled. I remembered. I nodded. That was enough. Years passed. North Star became one of the leading logistics technology companies in the region. People started calling me an entrepreneur, a visionary, a self-made founder. I never liked the phrase. Self-made was never completely true. I had built the company, but I had been helped by people who believed in me. Mr. Malik had fed me when I forgot to eat. Clara had challenged me when I was afraid. Daniel had protected me when the lawsuit came. My engineers had stayed late when we had no money. Even my failures had taught me something. I wasn't self-made. I was built by every person who had given me something when I needed it, including, strangely enough, my family. Because without their rejection, I might never have stopped. Without that painful night, I might have remained trapped inside a life that looked successful from the outside, but was slowly destroying me. I didn't thank them for hurting me, but I no longer needed to hate them for it. Then one afternoon, I received an unexpected invitation. Adrian was getting married. I stared at the message. He had found someone. Her name was Maya. She wasn't impressed by our family history. That was probably why Adrian loved her. She had met him after he left the company. She knew nothing about our old rivalry. When I met her, she looked at me and said, "So you're Ethan?" I laughed. "Apparently. Adrian talks about you. Hopefully nothing terrible." She smiled. "He says you taught him that failure doesn't have to be the end." I looked at Adrian. He shrugged. "I didn't say it like that." You should have. We laughed. At the wedding, my father sat beside my mother. For the first time in years, all of us were in the same room. But it wasn't uncomfortable. There was no competition, no inheritance discussion, no company politics, no one trying to prove anything. Just people. After the ceremony, Adrian found me outside. Do you ever think about how different things could have been? All the time. If I hadn't pushed you out, if Dad hadn't believed you, if Victor hadn't come, I smiled. Maybe I'd still be working there. He laughed, and we'd probably still be fighting. Probably. He looked at me. Would you change it? I thought about Clara, our home, the workshop, North Star, the students, the people I had met after leaving. No. He nodded. I wouldn't either. We stood together beneath the evening lights. Then Adrian said, I used to think you took everything from me. I looked at him. You didn't have much to begin with. He laughed. Exactly. He became serious. I thought you were the obstacle. And now, you were never the obstacle. He looked toward the wedding reception. I was. I put a hand on his shoulder. Don't live there anymore. He nodded. I won't. That was the last conversation we had about the past. Not because it had been forgotten, because it no longer controlled us. A few months later, my father asked me to visit the old family house. The property had finally been sold. He had kept one room untouched. My grandfather's study. On the desk was an envelope. My father handed it to me. Your grandfather left this for you. I opened it. Inside was a short letter. There was no great secret, no hidden fortune, no inheritance. Just one sentence that made me sit down. If you ever feel like you have lost everything, remember that a man who knows how to build can begin again anywhere. I read it twice. Then I folded the paper carefully. My father watched me. You understand now? Yes. What? That I never really walked away with nothing. He smiled. You carried the most important thing. I looked at the letter. My ability to build. Yes. I closed the envelope. For years, I had thought my family feared losing their company. They didn't. What they feared was discovering that the person they had discarded could live without them. And they were right. I could. But the greatest surprise wasn't that I built something bigger. It wasn't the money. It wasn't the recognition. It wasn't even North Star. It was that I eventually reached a place where I no longer cared whether they were impressed. Their approval had once been the destination. Now it was irrelevant. That night, I went home to Clara. She was sitting on the balcony, reading. She looked up. How was it? I smiled. Good. Closure? He sat beside her. Peace. She closed her book. Then she rested her head against my shoulder. I looked out at the city. Thousands of lights. Thousands of people. Thousands of lives I knew nothing about. And I thought about the young man who had once driven away with one suitcase, convinced he had lost everything. I wished I could go back and tell him something. You haven't lost your life. You've lost the version of it that was never yours. And one day, you'll understand that those are not the same thing. 5 years after I left my family's company, North Star opened its largest innovation center. It stood on land that had once been an abandoned factory. Now it was filled with laboratories, training rooms, workshops, and young engineers who reminded me of myself before I knew what failure felt like. The opening ceremony was supposed to be about North Star. Instead, I found myself thinking about a suitcase. One suitcase, 2 shirts, 3 pairs of jeans, an old laptop, a broken circuit board. That was everything I had believed I owned when I left. I stood on the stage while hundreds of people applauded. Clara stood near the front. My father sat beside my mother. Adrian was there too. For a moment, I looked at all of them. Then I looked at the young engineers behind me. These were the people who had never known me as my father's son. They only knew me as the person who had built something. That distinction mattered. After the ceremony, my father approached me. He was older now. His hair had turned almost completely white, but his eyes were peaceful. You did it, he said. I smiled. We did. He laughed. You still won't take all the credit. No. He looked around the building. Your grandfather would have loved this. I think so. He nodded. Then he reached into his pocket. He handed me a small photograph. It was old. Very old. I looked at it. It showed me and Adrian as children standing beside my grandfather in the workshop. I was holding a screwdriver. Adrian was holding a wrench. We were both smiling. I laughed softly. I haven't seen this before. Your mother found it. I stared at the photograph. There was something strange about seeing us that way. Before the competition, before the inheritance, before the company became a battlefield. Just two boys who believed their grandfather had built the greatest place in the world. My father said, "I wish I had protected that version of you." I looked at him. "You can't change the past." "I know, but you can stop repeating it." He nodded. "I've been trying." I put the photograph in my pocket. Then Clara called my name from across the room. I looked over. She was holding a small gift. "What is that?" "You'll see." She handed me the box. Inside was a miniature model of the first North Star prototype. I stared at it. "You made this?" "With the engineering team." I laughed. "You're making me sentimental." "Too late." She kissed my cheek. My father smiled. For a moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Complete. Not perfect. Not without scars. Complete. Later that evening, after everyone had gone, I returned to the old workshop. I had moved one of the original workbenches into the Innovation Center. The same scratched wood, the same small burn mark near the edge, the same metal drawer that stuck when pulled too quickly. I sat down. The room was quiet. I took out the old circuit board, then the photograph, then my grandfather's letter. 3 pieces of the past. 3 reminders of how far I had traveled. My phone buzzed. It was Adrian. "Dad wants to know if you're free Sunday." I smiled. "Tell him yes." A second message arrived. "He says he wants to cook." I laughed. "Then I'll bring food." Adrian replied. "Good, because he still thinks he can cook." I put the phone away. Years ago, a message from my family would have made my heart race. I would have wondered what they wanted, what I had done wrong, whether I needed to defend myself. Now I simply knew they were family again, but not because I had returned to who I used to be, because they had finally learned to meet the person I had become. There was a difference. The next Sunday, we had dinner together. My mother complained that nobody helped enough. My father burned the first batch of bread. Adrian made fun of him. I laughed. Clara sat beside me. At one point, my father looked around the table. "This is nice." My mother smiled. "Yes." He looked at me. I spent years thinking the family would survive because of the company. I listened. Then the company almost disappeared. He paused. And somehow this remained. I looked at the table. 4 adults. 1 new member of the family. No contracts. No shares. No titles. No inheritance. Just people. My father raised his glass. To starting over. I smiled. To not needing to. Everyone laughed. I lifted my glass. And in that moment, I realized something. I hadn't needed my family to become perfect. I had only needed to stop expecting them to be. That was the final piece of freedom. A year later, North Star launched a foundation for young entrepreneurs who had ideas but no resources. We gave them equipment, mentors, small grants. Most importantly, we gave them permission to fail. The first group included 30 students. One of them was a 17-year-old boy named Samir. He reminded me painfully of myself. Quiet, brilliant, always apologizing when his machines didn't work. One afternoon, he brought me a broken prototype. I think I ruined it. I looked at the machine. What happened? I connected the wrong circuit. Then fix it. He stared at me. What if I can't? I smiled. Then learn why. He looked confused. That's it. That's it. He nodded. Then he went back to the workshop. I watched him disappear through the door. And I thought about my grandfather. Build it anyway. Those 3 words had followed me for half my life. They had carried me through rejection, through loneliness, through failure. Through the night, I believed I had nothing. Now I was passing them to someone else. That was when I understood what my real inheritance had been. Not money, not a company, not a family name. It was the ability to keep building, even after everything collapsed. Especially then. Years later, people would tell the story differently. They would say I was the brilliant son who escaped a powerful family and built a technology empire. They would say my family underestimated me. They would say my success was revenge. They would be wrong. I didn't leave to punish them. I left because staying was destroying me. I didn't build North Star to frighten them. I built it because I needed something that belonged to me. I didn't become successful because I wanted them to regret losing me. I became successful because eventually I stopped caring whether they regretted it. That was the part nobody understood. My greatest victory wasn't watching my father admit he had been wrong. It wasn't seeing Adrian apologize. It wasn't defeating Victor. It wasn't even building a company larger than the one I had left. My greatest victory happened on an ordinary morning. I woke up. Clara was sleeping beside me. Sunlight came through the curtains. There was no emergency, no family argument, no meeting where I had to prove myself, no fear that someone would take away my place. I simply felt peaceful, and I realized I'd finally built a life I didn't need to escape from. I got out of bed, made coffee, opened the curtains. The city was waking up. Clara came up behind me. "Morning, morning." She wrapped her arms around me. "What are you thinking about?" I smiled. "Nothing." She laughed. "You're never thinking about nothing." I turned toward her. "Okay. What?" "I was thinking about the day I left." She looked at me. "What do you remember?" "The suitcase. That's all." "The rain. Anything else?" I thought for a moment. My father told me I should be grateful he was letting me leave with my dignity. Clara shook her head. "And what do you think now?" I looked at the woman beside me, at the home we had built, at the company that belonged to hundreds of people, at the workshop where young minds were learning to create, at the family I had rebuilt without demanding perfection from the one I was born into. Then I smiled. I think dignity was never his to give. Clara kissed me. "And everything else?" I looked outside. Everything else had become mine. Not because someone handed it to me. Not because I inherited it. Not because I defeated anyone. Because I built it. Piece by piece. Failure by failure. Choice by choice. I had once walked away carrying almost nothing. But I had carried the one thing nobody could take. The ability to begin again without becoming someone I wasn't. And that was enough. More than enough. Because the people who had once believed I was nothing eventually learned the truth. I hadn't been the weak link in their family. I had been the foundation they never understood. But by the time they finally realized what I was capable of, I no longer needed them to understand. I had already built everything they feared. And more importantly, I had built a life I loved. A life that didn't depend on their approval. A life that didn't need their apology. A life that didn't require me to win against anyone. I had stopped making them the center of my story. And that was the moment I finally became free.